Hello, my name is Alessandra Navarre. I'm an author based in Nova Scotia, Canada. When I write my books, I end up researching a lot of historical topics, especially the medieval Knights Templar. I'm also always on the lookout for new tidbits of information that would help me understand this mysterious medieval order. A few years ago, I came across a newspaper article that spoke about two mysterious stones found in northern New Mexico. There was a man mentioned in the article by the name Louis Serna. In the following interview, I'm going to be speaking to Louis directly, and I will quiz him about these standing stones, what he thinks about them, what his research shows, and if he has reached any conclusion whether or not these stones could be Templar in origin or not. The first half of the interview is dedicated to the general history of New Mexico, and in the second part, we will talk specifically about these standing stones. Enjoy. Hello, Louis.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Are you at your home in New Mexico?
Yes, I am. And it's my wife and we live in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Oh,
Albuquerque is centrally located in the state from top to bottom.
hmm. Oh, nice.
We are both from the northern part of New Mexico.
Oh, okay.
I was born in a place called Springer, New Mexico, which is up in northern New Mexico.
Hmm.
And I was born and raised there. And when I was 14 years old, my father worked for a company that was from the northern part of the state. So
Hmm.
we moved to a little town called Cimarron, New Mexico. I started school there as a freshman. And like the very next day after we moved there, I met this really pretty young lady, okay, who 6 years later became my wife. So
Oh,
we are
lucky you.
we are both from Cimarron, okay?
Cimarron, Cimarron. I always wondered about the pronunciation of the name Cimarron. I thought it looked kind of Celtic.
Well, it's Spanish, and the pronunciation of it is cimarron.
Cimarron.
Cimarron. You
What
have to
does it
roll the
mean?
R's in Spanish, okay?
Oh, okay.
And cimarron in Spanish means wild mountain goats, of which there were many up there in the early years.
Oh, nice. Are the goats still there?
Well, they are further north, and
Okay.
they're very shy mountain goats.
Okay. So, Louis, you are a prolific author of many books on history of New Mexico. So, I just want to let people know that you're an author, but also a historian. Can you tell me how you became a historian?
Okay, and that goes back to my early childhood when I lived in Springer with my family.
Hmm.
Uh, my father's father had died when my dad was only 12 years old. And my father's father, my grandfather, had a brother by the name of Louis Serna. Louis Serna was an older man who had no children, and he was an uncle to my dad. My dad was 12 years old at that time.
Hmm.
So my dad went to live with his uncle, who we came to call and know as Grandpa Levin, because he
Oh,
raised our dad. Okay.
oh, very nice.
Yeah. Now, Levin Serna was a master carpenter. He was an excellent carpenter. However, he had been raised in the mountains up in northern New Mexico when he was a boy, and he became a hunter, a very good hunter of deer, elk, bears, and other animals of that time.
Hmm.
He became very famous as a bear hunter. He would go on trips up into the mountains by himself with his horse and his dog and hunt bears. Now, at that time, there were way too many bears up in that part of the country. And the farmers had a lot of trouble with them because they would come and eat their garden crops and etc.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So they would call Levin to come and clear their place of the bears that were constantly there. So he became very famous for that. Word got back to people who were industrialists, I guess you could say, in Denver, Colorado. And they approached him and they told him that they would be glad to take the hides, the skins of the bears that he killed, and they would pay him for them. They would also take the meat of the bears that he killed because he killed so many. There was way too many of them. It was a humane thing, actually. So he did that. And he wrote a book. Here's what I'm getting at. My grandpa Levin wrote a book about his life as a bear hunter when I was a boy. By the time I got to be 14 years old, he was already an old man, uh,
Mm-hmm.
pretty much stayed at home kind of a guy. But people would write to him and ask him to send them a copy of his book. His books wound up all over the country and even among soldiers who were abroad. I remember uh, I remember one case where a soldier from Korea sent him a letter asking him to send him a book, and he did.
That's
So,
amazing.
so that was my introduction to books and stories told by people,
Mm-hmm.
mainly my
Mm-hmm.
grandfather. Now, he spoke Spanish, mainly Spanish because that's how he was raised. So when he got ready to write his memoirs, he had my mother write down verbatim his story in Spanish, and then she later translated it to English and produced the book for him. So I was very aware of all of this that was going on. Later, later when I was in high school and very interested in history and etc., uh, I found the Spanish manuscript that my mother had produced for my grandfather, Grandpa
Oh,
Levy.
fantastic.
And I cherish that to this day because that was my beginning of books. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I never studied the production of books,
Mm-hmm.
okay? Uh, uh, my experience, as you might say, an author, is that I would sit down and collect bits and pieces of information of a subject that I wanted to know more about.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
this dates back when there were no computers. Everything was either handwritten or typed on the typewriter.
Mm-hmm.
So I did a lot of that. And I began to accumulate these little piles of research information.
Right.
And I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with all this? I didn't know anything about writing books, and I certainly couldn't afford to hire an author. So I started arranging my notes in chronological order by
Mm-hmm.
date.
Mm-hmm.
And in that way, I could kind of go back in time and pull out a file and see what I wrote back then.
Right.
Well, this happened until I got to the point where I thought, well, I've got to do something with this. So I took my notes and everything and I retyped everything on the clickety click typewriter and I took it to a printer and I asked him, could he print that for me in some kind of book form? Now, at that time, it was Office Depot, and
Yep.
I took it to them, and they made a copy of the whole thing, sheets front and back, and they clipped the edges of the paper for the old alligator type binding. And that was the beginning of my experience as an author. I started producing my own books. And after a while, people started asking for my books, and I started sending them out, and people would pay me a, a little something, and away I went. So from that very first one, way back when I was still in high school, incidentally, that first book that I wrote was about my wife's family, about
Mm-hmm.
her mother. The title of that book is Tessie Maxwell of the Maxwell Land Grant family. And
Mm-hmm.
that is why I wrote it, is because Gloria's mother, Gloria is my wife, her mother, Tessie, was a Maxwell of that famous Maxwell land grant family.
Can you tell me more about the Maxwell land grants for those people who maybe don't know what that means?
Yes, the Maxwell family. And let's start by mentioning the name of the man who acquired the Maxwell land grant. His name was Lucian Bonaparte Maxwell. The Bonaparte is because he was of a family of Kaskaskia, Illinois, back in the time of Abraham Lincoln and those characters.
Okay.
His father was a man by the name of Hugh Maxwell, who had come from Ireland
Mm.
to the United States, and he settled in Kaskaskia. And there's a reason for that, but it takes a while to explain all that.
Okay.
Hugh, Hugh Maxwell married the daughter of a very prominent French Canadian merchant by the name of Pierre Menard.
Mm-hmm.
Today, there are several Menard family ventures in that part of the country descended from him. He became very famous as a French fur trapper, trader, businessman, and politician. Even though he was a Canadian after the time of the American Revolution. Incidentally, I should say that Pierre Menard's father was a man by the name of Jean Baptiste Menard from
Mm-hmm.
Canada.
Mm.
During the time that a very brash young military man was trying to organize a revolution up in the northeastern part of the country, Jean Baptiste Menard approached him and told him that he was sympathetic to his cause and offered him money, guns, supplies, and things that he needed at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And that military man was George Washington.
Oh.
So he provided all of these goods and services to him and introduced him to other Frenchmen who were willing to help them in their revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the father of Pierre Menard, who was the father of Marie Odile Menard. She became the wife of Hugh Maxwell.
Mm.
They
Okay.
became the parents of Lucian
Mm-hmm.
Maxwell.
Mm-hmm.
Lucian Maxwell, at a young age, got acquainted with Kit Carson, who I think everybody in the country knows a little bit about.
Yeah.
And they came out west as fur trapper traders and guides, and they became good friends. So when they came out west, they came to a place in northern New Mexico that is called Taos, T
Mm-hmm.
A O S, New Mexico. That place was famous because that's where all the French fur trappers and traders came to try to get into the Spanish government, meaning that at that time, New Mexico and all of the states north of New Mexico, like Colorado, Idaho, Utah, California, all of those were of the Spanish realm. The
Mm.
Spanish had claimed all that country and it belonged to them. And they did not want any incursions
Mm-hmm.
of the what they called Americanos.
Mm. Oh.
Americanos is a Spanish word that obviously means Americans, and to the Spanish people it included everybody who wasn't Spanish. The
Uh-huh.
Irish, the colonists, the French,
Even the
everybody
French.
became
Okay.
Americanos to them. They
Oh,
did not want them coming into the Spanish realm to upset what they had started, the colonization that they had
right.
going.
Right.
So these fur trappers, brash men that they were, mountain men, they came into northern New Mexico. They came to Taos, and over a period of time, they were finally accepted into that area. Now, one of the reasons why they were accepted into that area by the Spanish is because by the time they came here in the mid 1800s, early 1800s, northern New Mexico had become a department, a department of the Republic of Mexico. Mexico had declared their independence from Spain in 1821,
Mm-hmm.
and they proceeded to govern themselves as the Republic of Mexico. But they had a lot of problems with their management, with uh, everything about running a government. They needed help. Not
Mm-hmm.
only that, they needed money because there was no production of anything going on.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
they knew that the Americans up in the northern England area, they had declared their independence in 1776, and they were doing very well
Mm-hmm.
business-wise among
Right.
themselves and trading with European countries.
Right.
So they were making a lot of money and they were producing a lot of goods. And the Spanish wanted to trade with them for those goods, and yet they didn't want them in the country. Okay.
Yeah, it's an
However,
age-old problem
yes, yes.
with
So
countries.
over time, they became friendly with each other,
Okay.
and these trappers and traders started bringing goods from the New England area into the north of Spain. I'm sorry, the north of New Mexico to Taos, and that's where
Mm-hmm.
trade started. The
Mm-hmm.
capital, the capital of New Mexico is a Spanish town by the name of Santa Fe, Holy Faith, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Santa Fe is where the leaders of the then government, the then authorities, you might say, of New Mexico, that's where they lived. And
Mm-hmm.
eventually they began trading and things began to open up and it went on. Now, back to your question about the Maxwell land grant.
Mm-hmm.
When Lucian Maxwell came into the northern part of New Mexico, he did what a lot of other trapper traders were doing when they were coming into the north of the Spanish realm. They found eligible young ladies, okay, who were of age to marry, who were the daughters of some of these very wealthy Spanish men that lived in northern New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, at that time, the Spanish law forbid Americanos from buying or owning land. Okay?
Okay.
However, by marrying the daughters of these wealthy Spanish landowners, they became heirs. Okay?
I see.
Heirs through the daughter.
It
You see
was
how that
a
happened? Yes.
loophole in the law.
Yes. Yes. Well, one of those wealthy Spanish landowners was a man by Beaubien, a Frenchman. He had married a Spanish daughter and he had inherited wealth and, in fact, had already applied for and received a very large land grant in northern New Mexico
Mm-hmm.
through his marriage to this Spanish young lady. So, Lucian Maxwell comes into the area, discovers that he has a daughter who is only 13 years old, and he marries her. And in that way puts himself in line to inheriting the famous Beaubien Miranda land grant. When the old man died, the daughter and some of her brothers, sisters, inherited the land grant. Lucian Maxwell, at that time, who was very knowledgeable, ambitious, and capable, he bought out the other family members, and through his wife, Luz Beaubien, inherited the grant and changed it from the Beaubien land grant to the Maxwell land grant. And it became like a kingdom of northern New Mexico. He was the sole authority on everything because on that land grant, he has people were developing gold mines,
Mm-hmm.
lumber, every resource you can think of. And of course, they all had to pay him a fee for whatever they found and developed. So
Mm-hmm.
he became very wealthy. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the family that my wife, Gloria's mother, Tessie, is from.
Mm.
She, Tessie, was the granddaughter of Lucian Maxwell's brother, a man by the name of Ferdinand Maxwell.
Mm-hmm.
who himself was a very successful merchant and politician in Taos. So that whole story became my first book,
Mm-hmm.
my first
Mm-hmm.
official book, you might say.
So, how big was this land grant in
Almost 2 million acres.
2 million
Almost,
acres?
almost 2 million acres. It was big enough that it contained what you could say is the northwest corner of the state and some of southern Colorado. At that time, southern Colorado was part of the Spanish kingdom.
And then what happened to it later? Did it get
Yes,
disbanded somehow or repossessed
yes.
by the government?
Well, it got out of control. Uh, Initially, and during the time that he ran the land grant, he was very capable of it, except that he did business the way that the old trapper traders used to do business, on their word or on a handshake.
Mm-hmm.
So people would come to him and ask him if they could settle some part of the grant to raise some kind of crops. And he would say, sure, I'll take 1/10 or whatever it was at that time of whatever you produce, and you can work on that land. Well, over the years, those people came to assume that it was their land because they were working on it.
Uh-huh.
But it wasn't. It was a sharecropper thing. Nothing was legal. Nothing was on paper. That's the way he did business.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, it got completely out of control, and other ranchers were challenging him about his
Mm-hmm.
livestock and everything else. And he got an offer from a syndicate from England,
Hmm.
offered to buy the land grant. And he sold it to them and retired to the southern part of New Mexico. But even in the sale of the grant, there was a lot of legal haggling that went on because nothing was in paper, like I said earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So the land grant was sold. At the time that they sold it, they did a survey of the land grant as it was described in the earlier grant paperwork. And they found that it was not 2 million acres. Uh, it was less than that, but still huge.
Mm-hmm.
Later,
Mm-hmm.
later, the land grant was resold to another European syndicate, and it went on and on for some 20 years until finally, at the end of it all, guess who wound up with the land? The lawyer, because of the fees that were owed to him, and nobody had the money to pay him.
Mm-hmm.
So he claimed the grant as payment for his legal efforts over the last umpteen years, 20 years or so. And that's what it is today. It is still an active ranch, very large ranch that
Mm-hmm.
is owned by descendants of that lawyer, a man by the name of Frank Springer. In a nutshell, that is the history of the Maxwell land grant.
Mm-hmm. So another thing that you mentioned in your books is the Spanish Trail. I don't know anything about the history of New Mexico really. So can you tell me and my viewers and readers what the Spanish Trail was?
Yes, yes. And to do that, I kind of have to go back a little bit, okay, in
Sure,
time.
sure, please do.
Okay, the Spanish came to the New World, you can say, in 1519, when Hernan Cortes sailed into the Gulf of Mexico with a small army of soldiers
Mm-hmm.
and landed in what is now Veracruz, Mexico. At that time, it wasn't Mexico. At that time, it was part of the Aztec kingdom. They landed at Veracruz, and very tactfully, Hernan Cortes managed to get the tribes of other Native Americans who were living in Mexico at that time to ally with him in a battle against the Aztecs, who were the rulers of then Mexico. And they were a very vicious tribe, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Very, they were very modern for their time, but they were very cruel. So
The
Cortes,
Aztecs.
yes,
Hmm.
Cortes and his other Indian allies defeated the Aztecs and thereby claimed all of that land for Spain.
Hmm.
Now, at that time, there was nothing going on north of what is now Mexico. It was all open land. I'm talking about the states that are now uh, Colorado, Arizona, Nevada,
Hmm.
California, Oregon, Washington, etc. All of that was Spanish land that they had claimed as a result of their victory over the Aztecs.
Hmm.
Okay, that happened in 1519. In 1540, the Spanish had pretty well settled into then Mexico, established themselves as uh, uh, a Spanish land, you could say, and they sent an explorer by the name of Francisco Coronado. They sent him up north into what is now New Mexico because they heard that there was rich gold cities there.
Hmm.
In
Hmm.
fact, they had heard the legend of these 7 cities of gold,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
you can uh, get that on the internet and get that whole story, but it's very interesting. So Coronado comes north into what is now New Mexico. He comes up along the Rio Grande, which runs the length of the state from bottom to top. And along the Rio Grande, he finds that there are many villages of Native Americans who are not hostile. In
Hmm.
fact, they're very progressed in their lifestyle. They live in mud brick homes called pueblos.
Pueblos,
Okay?
right. Hmm.
Yes. So the Spanish met with them, interacted with them, had a few skirmishes, but overall they came to the conclusion that they were going to have to live together.
Hmm.
Okay? The world had changed for the Native Americans. The Spanish had come. So the Spanish settled up into northern Mexico, which is now New Mexico. And that's
Right.
why it's called New Mexico.
New Mexico, right.
Now, that happened in 1540. Later, in 1598, another famous Spaniard by the name of Don Juan de Oñate led a large group of settlers that came up into New Mexico to colonize, to formally colonize that whole area for Spain.
Mm.
They went through a lot of hardship, but eventually they got settled in, and the Spanish became the state of New Mexico. Okay.
Okay.
At that time, it was called La Nueva España, the New Spain.
New Spain,
Yes.
right.
Okay.
Right.
Now, they settled in, they started living their lives in what is now New Mexico,
Hmm.
but something happened back down in Mexico City. In 1821, the native people, the native Indians of Mexico, got tired of these Spanish rulers that were controlling everything they did in Mexico, and they revolted against them, threw them
Well,
out
of
of the
course,
country.
it was their land. They were just
Exactly,
trying to take it back.
exactly. So in 1821, they formed the Republic of Mexico, no
Hmm.
longer Spanish, but something strange happened. Up here in New Mexico, where we Spanish are from, okay, in this New Mexico area,
Hmm.
the Republic of Mexico had thrown out the Spanish from Mexico, but here was this large colony of Spanish people
Hmm.
still living in northern New Mexico. The Mexican people in Mexico tolerated them. They did not throw them out,
I see.
but
Hmm.
but as well, they did not give them the equal
Hmm.
political standing of the people down in Mexico who were now native Indian Mexican people. So New Mexico kind of became the adopted unwanted child, you might say.
Right,
Okay.
right, right.
And the Mexican government did not provide all the goods and services that they provided to the people down in Mexico. So
Mm,
the Spanish people up in northern New Mexico were pretty much on their own, raising
right.
their animals, farming,
Mm-hmm,
and subsiding as best they could. So
right.
now we come into the area we were talking about a few minutes ago about the
Mm-hmm.
trapper traders that came
Yes.
the, from the east, okay? When they came into the area and they brought goods to trade to those people who were in northern New Mexico who were Spanish, they said, wow, we want more of that, okay?
Mm,
Because they weren't getting uh, as much as they needed from old Mexico. So
mm-hmm,
they kind of quietly welcomed these Frenchmen that were coming into the north of New Mexico, into the north of then Mexico. Now,
mm-hmm,
in 1846, several years later, 1846, the United States government comes into the area, and on the excuse of what they called the Mexican War, they came in and they annexed all
mm-hmm.
of those lands that were north of what is now the boundary of Mexico into the United States government, and they claimed them as United States territories.
Right.
New Mexico became one of them. Okay? So I kind of had to explain all of that to answer your question, but you see
Mm-hmm,
how that happened. Okay? Obviously, there was a lot more to that, and there still is, but generally,
mm-hmm.
that's how it came to be.
So there were Spaniards coming to New Mexico, then later the French, right? Irish, English. Um, and you said that uh, Hernan Cortez came to North America in, did you say 1519?
1519.
1519. Okay, so was he the first European, and his crew, were they the first Europeans to arrive in that part of North America? Or do you
Yes.
think somebody else got there before them?
No. They were the first Spanish to arrive in that part
Mm-hmm.
of North America. Earlier, there had been other explorations along the Atlantic coast. Spanish adventurers like De Soto and
Mm-hmm.
others who discovered Florida and who
Right.
discovered lands all the way up as far as New York. There had been other Spanish explorers, others who had explored the Mississippi River area.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
they had been there before Cortez showed up in 1519 at Veracruz.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now, I need to. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
It's all right.
your question earlier was about the Spanish trails. Okay.
Yes, the Spanish,
Okay.
the Spanish Trail. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Your question was, what do we know about it? Well, during that time, like I said, when the Republic of Mexico established themselves and they kind of left the northern part of that area, New Mexico, which was in the hands of Spanish settlers, when they kind of ignored them, didn't provide all the goods and services that they needed, they took it on themselves to start going beyond the Spanish realm,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that they
Mm-hmm.
started going along the trails that they followed out toward the Californias and
Mm-hmm.
the Pacific
Mm-hmm.
Northwest and that part of the country. They started going out in those directions to try to develop trade so that they could get the things that they wanted and needed.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it became a very active trading route that they followed that became known as the Spanish Trails.
Spanish Trails. Okay.
Now, let's briefly let me talk a little bit about trails, okay?
Mm-hmm.
In the history of the United States, especially back east, there have been many very capable woodsmen, let's just say, like Daniel Boone and
Mm-hmm.
Davy Crockett and others like them, who are credited with having blazed the trails
Mm.
from the east toward the west and made discoveries and did wonderful things by their travels, okay? And they were given credit for having, again, blazed the trails, meaning
Right.
found new trails. Well, in fact, they didn't do that. All they did was simply made friends with Indians from those areas who had lived there all their lives and their fathers before them, and they already knew all of those trails and where they went.
Right. They
So,
were native,
yes,
indigenous
yes,
trails.
they were natives. They already knew about all those trails that later Daniel Boone and others followed. Okay? Now, with regard to the Native Americans, how did they know about those trails? Well, all they simply did was what nature taught them to do. They were simply following animals that they were hunting for food. And the animals were the ones that were actually creating those trails in their search for food, for better grazing lands.
Right.
So it was simply a matter of Indians following game animals, and then later Americans using Indians to show them where the trails were. Okay? The same thing happened with the Spanish trails that we were just talking about. They were simply following trails that had been used by Native Americans for centuries,
Right.
going from one place to another. So just to clarify that. Okay.
Are these Spanish trails marked with inscribed stones or?
Yes, yes, they were at that time, um, and marked in various ways. Okay. Some places they would etch in stone messages. Uh, Juan Rivera was here, or whoever. Okay, and uh, and then through symbols they would indicate what direction they went, so that
Okay.
whoever followed would follow them. And
Okay.
they would also inscribe images of water holes, which were very important. There is water this way. There is danger this way. There is
Right.
whatever. Okay?
Right.
All of that is etched in stone in various places throughout that whole region. Uh, Incidentally, just outside of Albuquerque, there is a large, uh, I'll call it a mountain because it's that big, made of stone. And along the bottom of this stone cliff, you might say, Spanish explorers who traveled by that area stopped there and they carved their names onto that stone and left dates there. And in some cases, even left a short message about themselves. Well, one did it, another one did it, until now it's called Monument Rock because it is full of names of early Spanish. And then later, when Union Army soldiers came into the area as a result of their invasion of Spain, those soldiers left their names above. It became just an amazing monument rock. Okay, now that happened there north of Albuquerque, but there are other places also where people have left their messages. Okay.
So speaking of inscribed stones, I know that New Mexico has some mysterious carved stones that are in other languages than
Yes.
Spanish or English.
Yes.
So can you maybe say something about the mysterious stones?
Yes. I have, bear with me a little bit.
Sure. Take your time.
I made a copy of a picture to show you of one of my books. Okay. I'll hold it up and see if you can see it.
Okay. Hold it up higher. Oh, now, yes, now I see. It says, New Mexicans, who really are we?
Okay. This is a book that I wrote, and I don't know if you can see the pictures clearly.
I see a Viking man, Celts or Gauls, and Phoenicians.
Exactly.
I like all those I like all three. I'll take
Okay.
Vikings, Celt,
I
and
know you do because that's your part of the country. I know that. Okay. But what I am showing here are the different people who came to New Mexico before the Spanish, way back in history.
hmm
Some during the time of Christ, okay? Meaning shortly before Christ, shortly after Christ. Obviously, the Vikings came into the eastern part of the country. We know about that. The Celtics and the Gauls, okay, as Irishmen also. The Phoenicians, and that's kind of what you were hinting at a few minutes ago. The Phoenicians left a large stone, very large stone, that is approximately, I'll say approximately 4 feet by 4 feet, okay? On the face of this stone, there is a message that was carved into it in the Phoenician slash early Hebrew language. And that is an amazing stone because um, it has been explored and it had been studied. And some people have said it's a hoax. Other people have
hmm
said that it's a legitimate message.
hmm
I believe that it is a legitimate message. Uh, Let me say something carefully here, okay?
Sure,
Because it
sure.
because it's studied around that particular stone.
hmm
That stone is called Mystery Rock.
Mystery
It's
Rock.
also it's also known as the Decalogue Stone.
hmm
And
what does Decalogue mean?
Decalogue means that it has inscriptions and writing and message on it. There is a message, there is text on it.
Mm.
Decalogue. Decalogue is like a message left. Okay? Okay?
Yes.
Okay. Now, with regard to that particular stone, okay, when it was first discovered, it was studied by authorities, uh,
hmm
archaeologists, others from the University of New Mexico. And at first, it was determined to be a hoax. They claimed that it had been pecked on there by college students from the University of New Mexico at some time. Well, that was absolutely wrong, okay? It was not that. There was too much evidence to prove that it was done very, very long time ago, and that it is in the Phoenician and Hebrew script. Now, why is there that reluctance for archaeologists and other officials of the state and government to do legitimate investigations and to help us understand and know what really happened there? Why don't they do that? The only thing that I can surmise, I'll set this down. The only thing that I can surmise as a result of my own efforts to try to get help from authorities
hmm
is that, number one, these are men who have spent many years of their life in college earning degrees to get
hmm
to where they are.
hmm
They have an armful of degrees that they are not willing to risk on anything that might be a hoax. They're just not
hmm
going to risk their credentials and their positions
And their career and
and their
tenure
careers
and
and their careers.
pension and all that. So they have a lot to lose. I
They
understand.
have a lot to lose, okay? I have met personally with at least one of those major persons,
hmm
and I asked him point blank, you know, what I just told you. And all he could do was sit back in his chair, fold his arms across his stomach, and just look at me like, don't you know? So
hmm
I knew what he was saying, although he said nothing. Okay. So that needs to be said as a reason why there is so much about New Mexico that
hmm
happened in the very distant past
hmm
that people are so reluctant to admit to it or to do any study of it. I wrote this book about it because it just needs to be told and it needs to be said. And I have pictures and instances and interviews that I did proving that these people were here. One of them is pretty amazing. This Libyan character.
hmm
There is in the southern part of the state an area called Mogollon. Mogollon was the place where a very old Indian tribe lived, and they are famous for their pottery. A pot was found, okay, and it's in my book. A pot was found with an image of a fish on the painted on the pot. The fish is very clearly a catfish because it has marbles on the front of it, like catfish do.
Yes.
Within the picture of the catfish, there are characters, what appear to be characters of some kind of language. Okay? This is on a pot that was created by an Indian woman umpteen years ago. At some point, the pot was in a place, a museum, where a person that is very familiar with the Libyan language looked at that pot and said, hey, that pot is a catfish. And whoever was with him said, yes, it's obviously a catfish. And he said, no, he said, the characters within the picture of the fish spell catfish in the Libyan language. How would that have happened? Okay? So you see the connection.
It's a strange coincidence. If anybody claims it's a coincidence, a very strange one.
Yes, far more than coincidence, okay? So that is just a case of one of these different people from the Middle East who came here. Also, of course, early Hebrews, Egyptians, even Romans, the Moors, obviously, and on and on. So that in answer to your question, your comment.
So it sounds like the knowledge of North America was out there long before Christopher Columbus.
Yes. And it's so obvious, you know, it's irritating. It's irritating for a person who has seen this with your eyes, who has known the story, written about it, as in my case, irritating that there is not any further study by people of authority. And the biggest reason, obviously, is because they do not want to change history as it was written way back by them. By them, meaning people like them.
Well, they say history is written by the victors.
Exactly.
And as the balance of power in the world changes, there's always someone else on top, someone else who is the new victor. And so history gets corrected, or it reveals itself to us over time. And they say truth is the daughter of time.
Who knows? Now, you know what happened to the Romans, okay? They were at the height of their civilization, and look where that went. And I'll ask you today, what's going on in our country? Are we on the path of the Romans? Who knows? Who knows? The Romans were destroyed by what at that time were supposed to be Vandals, people of little character, little knowledge, little education, little anything. The Gauls, the Huns, etc. Now,
well, the Huns are among my ancestors. Actually, I am part Hungarian, so the word Hun is in the name, Hungarian, right?
Yes,
Hungarian.
Yes.
So yes, I know how quickly things can change, and how you wake up one morning and the world is different.
Exactly. Now, unfortunately, terms like the Huns have become words denoting somebody fierce and somebody evil and somebody cruel and all that. So it's funny how labels are applied, to innocent people. You see what I'm saying,